After we've declared the data members for a class, the next step would be to create what are called constructor methods. Let me write that out for you. I'll put it in a comment here. Constructor methods allow us to instantiate or declare a class object and provide that object with some data. Constructor methods are always declared as public, and they're also always declared using the same name as the class. So we start out by writing public name, and then we provide parameters or arguments for the pieces of data that we want to provide to the class object in this constructor. So what I'm doing here is creating three parameters, F, M, and L for first name, middle name, and last name. So I close off the parameter list with a closing parenthesis. Then I come down and add a opening curly brace, move down a line, and all we have to do here are simple assignment statements where we write first equals F, middle equals M, and last equals L. And that's an L, not a 1. Sometimes it looks like a 1, but it's an L. So that constructor will be used to create a name with the first, middle, and last name. I say that because it's also possible to create more than one constructor. We can create a second constructor using the same beginning, public name, and in the parameter list I have to provide a different number of parameters than the one I did before. So for example, in the first constructor method I had 3 parameters, F, M, and L. For the second constructor I can only have 2 parameters, F and L. So what we'll do is we'll assign F to first, and then for middle name we'll just assign the empty string since a parameter was not provided, and for the last name we'll do L. Now it doesn't make much sense, but just to demonstrate and kind of stress this fact that we can have multiple constructors of the same name, we'll create one last constructor with just the last name. So we'll say first is equal to empty string, middle is equal to empty string, and then last name is equal to L. The reason we can have multiple methods with the same name is due to a feature of object-oriented programming languages called overloading. When you overload a method, you're saying that I'm going to use a method with the same name, but I'm providing a different set of parameters than any of the other methods with that same name. So you see I have 3 methods all named name, but each one has a different parameter list. This first constructor method has 3 parameters, the second method has 2, and the last one just has 1. That's how the compiler is able to differentiate between method calls with the same name, is by looking at the parameter list. And then it can flesh out which method you're trying to use, or which constructor method you're trying to use based on which parameter list it's looking at. When we call a constructor, we provide it with data, and then that data is assigned to the object that's created in the declaration statement. We're going to demonstrate that in another lesson or two, but I just wanted to point out what we're doing with the constructor. Before we leave though, let's look at one last example. We can also have what's called a default constructor. And a default constructor has no parameters, and it simply assigns each data member a default value, usually based on that data type. So for a string, the default value for a string is the empty string, just like the default value for an integer would be 0, or for a double as well. So this way I can create a name object without assigning it any data at the time if for some reason I need the object without any data in it. So it's always a good idea in any class that you create to add a default constructor to the definition. Interestingly enough, the compiler will provide a default constructor for you if you don't provide one yourself, but it's usually a good idea in a class definition to go ahead and make the default constructor explicit so that someone looking at the class definition will understand exactly what's happening when the default constructor is called. So that wraps it up for constructors. That's just about all we can talk about, certainly at this stage of the course. We're almost ready to use the class. We just need to add at least one more method so that we can display the data that we've put into an object with the constructor. So we're going to write a method called toString. The toString method will pull out the first, middle, and last name of a name object in that order. And that's an arbitrary decision. We don't have to do it that way. We could choose some other way to return the name, but just as easy as anything else and probably makes the most sense. We could write other methods to display the name, last name first, or display just the initials, and at some point in time we probably will write some of those methods. But what we want with toString is just a very basic representation of the data in an object, sometimes called the state of the object, that we can look at at any time. So that's what we're going to do with toString. So now we're ready to work with this name class. So what we need to do first is save the file. I'm going to go back to our DOS prompt, and we need to compile it. So we're going to write javac name.java. Hopefully it will compile without any errors, and it did. So that means the class, at least syntactically, is correct. So now we're ready to see if it really works. So what we need to do is create another program, a test program. So we're going to call it nametest.java. Sometimes these are also called driver programs, but I like test a little bit better. So it's public class nameTest is the name of the class. Public static void main string args. I could have used my template file, but this is easy to type it in. So here's where we begin to create the class. Declaring a class object and assigning data to it is a process called instantiation. Let me write that out as a comment. Because what we're doing is we're creating an instance of the name class. And the way we do that is by writing the class name, followed by the name of the object we want. We'll call this one my name. Then calling the constructor, which means using the assignment operator, followed by the keyword new, followed by our data. So I'll put my name in, like so. When this line executes, my name will be an instance of the name class, and the first name will be Michael, the middle name will be Mason, and the last name will be McMillan. Let's create another object. This time we'll call the second constructor we created, like so. Let's instantiate a third object. Well, let's call this a name equals new name, and then we'll just use the third constructor. And then finally, now let's look at how we can display the data from those name objects. System out print line. And to call the toString method, we use my name, followed by a period or dot, and then the method toString. Let's check this to see if it works before we go any farther and look at the other name objects. So let's close out the program with our closing curly braces. Save the file. Go back to our DOS window. I'll leave it on top. Let's clear the screen because it's getting a little messy there. And type javac nametest.java. Came back quickly. So type Java nametest. And there we see that my name has the values Michael, Mason, McMillan. Let's do one more just as a proof of concept. And we'll do your name. And so we call toString with your name.toString. And notice I use the open close parentheses with methods that don't require any parameters. That's one of the features of Java. Some languages don't require that. Save the file. Compile it again, and then call it. And so my name has the data values Michael, Mason, McMillan, and your name has the data values Raymond, empty string, Williams. Notice that there's an empty string between Raymond and Williams because that's what the constructor assigned to the middle name when we only provided a first and last name. Let me bring the program back up so we can take a look at it. So to review, when we instantiate an object, we declare an object just like we would declare a primitive data type, but then we call the constructor by using the keyword new followed by the class name. And then the arguments to the constructor will be whichever set of data we wish to provide to that object, either a full set or a partial set or an even less or more partial set, depending on how you look at that. And then if we want to display the data, we have a method to do that called toString, which gets called by using the class object name, my name or your name, followed by the dot operator, followed by the method toString. And even though we don't have any data to pass into the method, we still use the open and close parentheses. That's how you initially assign data to your class objects. But there's other ways to do that using what are called getter and setter methods, well, especially setter methods for setting data, and getter methods are also used to return data from a class object. And we're going to look at those two types of methods in the next lesson.